The following was recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic through Zoom meetings in accordance with local health guidelines.
So my name is Chalmer Williams, and my testimony of how I came to the faith, to coming to know my coming to Jesus moment, all started in college. I was about 22 years old, and senior year in college, getting ready to graduate, and a friend of mine that's still friends to this day, named Alonzo. We had met in the basketball courts of the campus on the bleachers. He didn't know me, I didn't know him, but somehow we shared mutual circles. And so he was a few years older than me, and he was a part of a ministry called Campus Outreach, where they minister to college students in various different ways. And so we hooked up one day, and he shared the gospel with me. And, the age-old question, if you died today, where do you think your soul would go? And most people would say, I don't know, but I said heaven. And so he said, why do you think you would go to heaven? And as I began to explain, I realized in my heart that my answer wasn't solid or wasn't grounded in what the truth was. It was based on, pieces of stuff I was piecing together based on what I saw in church and experienced, but not knowing for myself. And so I could have said the Lord's confession right there and been saved, but just wasn't ready because, he was talking about the Trinity, and he was talking about, John 3:16 and how much God loved you so much that he died and for the sins of the world. And all of that was new to me because I didn't come up in that type of, religion, or I didn't come up that way. Let me just say it like that. I came up in a way that you speak in tongues as your way to get into heaven. You speak in tongues as your way to call yourself saved or filled with the Holy Spirit. And so it was all like new and I just didn't understand. And so time went by, and Christmas break came. I thought I was going home for Christmas break, and I end up not going home. And make matters worse, I was doing some things I wasn't supposed to be doing. These are the years of early Fast and the Furious movies. So I had a souped up car, and I'm flying down the road, and I didn't have a license. My license was suspended, and didn't have proper registration. I'm just driving pretty much. And so get pulled over 3 days before Christmas, and I get took into jail. You know what I mean? Car gets impounded, the whole nine. And so while I'm in jail, all I could think of is that conversation I had with Alonzo just a few months prior. And, I felt so defeated. You know what I mean? I was alone, and nobody's on campus, and I couldn't go home. All my money I had spent bail money to bail myself out. And so by the time I got home, make a long story short, it was 1 or 2 in the morning. And I went down in my apartment on my knees, and I just told God, I'm tired of living this life. I'm surrendering everything. I don't understand, but I want you to come into my heart, and I'm ready to make a commitment. And from that day, that was December 2004. That's when my new life began, and walking with Christ.
Happy Father's Day, everybody. Welcome to the Mr. Misfits podcast. This is a co-op episode. It is not just Mr. Misfits. Welcome to the Fatherhood Fridays podcast as well. If you are listening on Friday, it is Fatherhood Fridays. If you're listening on Tuesday, it is Mr. Misfits. If you are listening on Father's Day, happy Father's Day, because then we all know it's really Sunday. So today we are we have a really cool opportunity. We actually already recorded this, but we decided, it wasn't good enough. We're going to do this again, and we're going to do this in a much more planned out way rather than us just kind of freestyling, talking. But I have with me the host of Fatherhood Fridays, so it's coming a very good friend of mine, Chalmer Williams. And we are here to actually talk about this idea of what biblical fatherhood is, what the role of a father is, and why all of this stuff actually matters. So, Chalmer, welcome to Ministry Misfits. And of course, this is your show. So, how's it going with Fatherhood Fridays?
Well, Fatherhood Fridays is going good, and thanks for having me on. This is exciting to be able to do a crossbreed between two episodes that will be airing at the exact same date and time. So we on this end, Fatherhood Fridays, we are doing well, heavy into season 5 and just trying to keep the train moving.
Yeah, and so for you Fatherhood Friday people, you probably heard me before. I was a guest on Chalmer's show earlier on in season 5 talking about the loss of our daughter. We are in the middle of season 1 of Ministry Misfits. This, I don't even know. I gave up trying to count what episode number I was on after like number 5 because I had already messed it up.
It confuses me too.
Yeah, I gave up real early because I realized I forgot to record something and then it got thrown in the middle and then we switched some stuff around. So my listeners already know math is not a strong suit, and so they probably gave up after episode 2 of trusting me with my episode numbers. But we are in season 1, I know that. But today we are today we are going to talk about this idea of fatherhood and what this actually means for us, both from a social standpoint, but especially from a biblical standpoint for those of us that are believers. So let's start there. Chalmer, give us some basic definitions. What is the definition of a father biblically? But then also, what is this social idea of fatherhood that we see more often in culture?
Well, that's a great question. And I would start off by saying the biblical definition of father, comes from the Hebrew word Abba, right? And, that is the one, who actively provides guidance, love, and support to enhance the development and growth of your purpose or the people that you care for. And so that would be, in a nutshell, biblically, how you would define biblical fatherhood or nurturing fatherhood. I believe biblical and nurturing fatherhood goes hand in hand with those meanings. Social fatherhood, it's become a question mark over the years. It keeps getting redefined, and we don't have these concrete words to define fatherhood because of the absence of fatherhood and many other things I'm pretty sure we're going to go into. And so you'll often hear people say that fathers are provider, fathers are protector, fathers are, workers, but, provider, protector, worker of what? Like, you can go so many different ways with those definitions, and a lot of times socially, when it comes to fatherhood, we define it based on our own lived experiences, what we saw growing up,
or what we didn't see,
or what we didn't see growing up. Thank you. And so it begins to shape our cognitive thoughts, self-concepts, and esteem and behavior of what we think fatherhood is. I had one time, this was years ago, a kid told me that fatherhood is just a person that pays child support on time. I mean, do you see how minimizing that is? Like, a father is just a person that pays child support on time.
And that I think is where we actually need to start, is this idea of we need to really define this idea of nurturer. Because there, depending on how you describe nurturing of a child, is going to really affect what level we're on when we start talking about this idea of a father versus a nurturer. somebody that is providing money for the food and for the water and everything else, you could probably qualify as they are nurturing their child. But that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about the idea of a nurturing father. So give us a better understanding of what it is you're talking about here.
Absolutely. And so, when we think of nurturing or nurturer, for most of us, women come to mind,
Hmm.
right? Women come to mind as it comes to a nurturing mother, a nurturing woman. We don't necessarily think that fathers can be nurturers, and it's so far from the truth. And a lot of that has to do with societal norms. But let me kind of wrap that up and just answer the question. A nurturing father is a one that cultivates and supports the attitudes and skills of their children, hoping to benefit them as men and women in their relationships and in who they need to become.
Mm.
So it's not enough to be present, but we have to be involved. And I think a lot of times saying just being present, there's nothing wrong with that, but the standard is so low that it's like as long as you're in the house, that's good enough. But no, like you have to be involved and you have to be in tune with your children or the people that you have called to father.
Right.
If you're a father figure.
And that's what, we can, start kind of drawing in the first question a little bit. This is where, biblical Christian fatherhood kind of separates itself out from societal, is the idea of that last piece of nurturing, of getting them to, helping them develop what, to where they're supposed to become, really is, it's the same thing we talk about when we talk about discipleship. Of it's more than just being there and occasionally, playing with them, or occasionally take. This is about its full development on full scale, from physical to mental to spiritual development, of how do they become the person that God's actually designed them to be. And that takes way more than just, being there on a regular basis. There's so much more involved to that.
Right. And studies have shown that children who spend time alone with more than twice a week with their dad or father uh, have a higher sense of empathy and become
Mhm.
more compassionate as adults.
Right. Right.
This
And
is the
that,
father,
yeah.
not the mother. This is the father. A child that spends at least twice a week with their father or dad become has a higher sense of empathy and more compassion with adults.
And that I think is what really, we can start going into some of the deeper stuff here. That really kind of explains why we see what we do right now, culturally, as a country, as far as this lack of empathy, coordinated with the lack of an actual understanding of what the father is supposed to be and where they're supposed to be at. And I don't know if it's necessarily completely proportional or not, but this part of this is really a fact that we have not done a good enough job of actually, talking about the nurturing side of fatherhood within a church context, because we like to, we talk about, David going out and slaying the giant and defending, defending God and defending country and all this. And we look at all of these different biblical examples of what we're trying to say biblical manhood is supposed to look like, and we're completely ignoring this other side. We still have this 1950s mentality of leave it to
Right,
Beaver. But
right,
even in
right,
that setting, we actually see a father that is somewhat nurturing, but we ignore that part of it because we just want to focus on the he's out there making a bunch of money, so that way, his kids can go do what they're wanting to do, and there's food on the table and everything else. And we completely miss an entire section of who that is. And you and I talked about this the first time we recorded this, but
right.
really is a misunderstanding of who God is.
Right, absolutely, because the idea is, like I said earlier, when we don't have a concrete idea of what fatherhood, then it becomes these two extremes of either total toxic masculinity,
Hmm.
like you were describing David. He's out there slaying the giant. He's killing Goliath and cutting off his head. And
But
so
he's also the one on the roof watching his neighbor bathe and then going and getting the husband killed.
right.
You
and
know.
and and we talk about that constantly, but we don't talk about the passive side of David and how he was a worshiper at heart, or
Hmm.
how he was a poet, or just how he shouted until or worshiped God until his clothes fell off. We touch on it, but we really don't talk about it because it doesn't look masculine to the
Hmm.
average man. And I believe that because of history, in society, we want to look at fathers in one macho way or now a metrosexual way. And either one of those are unhealthy.
Right. And this is where, for Mr. Misfits, see us own people, this is where we get into what we always talk about with the continuums and the paradigms of, there's one extreme over here, there's one extreme over here. And typically what we find is that the biblical model is somewhere in the middle.
Absolutely.
And that's really what we're wanting to get into a little bit here today. But first we need to address, one side of this that unfortunately is an all too real reality. Typically this is a reality that is associated more with the African American community, but we all know that that's not actually reality, that this is a worldwide, multi-ethnic, there is no divide here, of the idea of an absent father and what that is and why this is a big issue. So Chalmer, give us a little bit of the history here, because you said you just came back from a conference that gave you a lot of good insight into a lot of this stuff that it changed, not necessarily changed your thinking, but allowed you to really expound on it a little bit more. So, what is this idea, the history of the absentee dad?
So if we're just focusing on America or the United States, and I'm gonna just start with my race first. Fathers or dads have never, from the beginning of the inception of the United States, fathers or dads have never had, or black fathers or dads have never had a equal opportunity to be a nurturing father from its inception. And so let me explain. Let's talk about something like slavery.
Hmm.
Slavery, men and dads were considered sperm donors and labor. So from the jump, you were automatically impregnate your wife, and then you were separated from her to go out and work, and then you were sold to, the older you got, you were sold to another family, and another another black family impregnate that woman,
Hmm.
and then go out in the field and work, or be an indentured servant or a house slave. So you see, from the jump, we're not even connected with our family. We're so focused on work. We're so focused on being a sperm donor that from the beginning of slavery, we've never had an opportunity to be a nurturing father, because slavery automatically took us away, and us meaning African Americans, took us away from our wife, took us away from our kids, and we had to work, and then we got sold and put in another family and had to produce more kids with another woman we don't know, and the cycle just kept going and going and going.
And this is something for people. You and I actually next week, we've already recorded this, but next week, Mr. Misfits, Chalmer will be back with us, and we're going to be talking a lot more about this sort of thing, as far as what systemic racism and assimilation and code switching and all that stuff actually looks like in today's terms. But this is one of the things that Lecrae actually was the first person I ever actually heard talk about this, of the idea of deadbeat dad was taught to us at when
Absolutely.
we were
And
slave, and it completely is countercultural to what we see with in the continent of Africa, especially within more of the tribal areas of Africa.
right.
It's family centered. It's much more about it's about the community. It's about all this other stuff. And so the idea that because you are black, you are automatically going to have this as a father situation, first of all, is a horrible stereotype and a racial stereotype. But beyond that, it's something that, even if that was the case, this is something that was brought about from a white supremacy movement within the chattel slave era, that was taught, and the example was set. And so this is one of the arguments that I don't know why it's not brought up more when people try to argue the idea of gang violence in the inner city as a reason to not support social justice movements. The idea of the gangs and all this other stuff, where you've got a bunch of boys who never had dad around, that are trying to figure it out for themselves and trying to provide and keep themselves alive. Even if that was the real reality for every black male in America, the cycle that started it was started by the white slave owners.
Right. So we've been embedded to focus on work and being
Hmm.
sperm donors from the gate of us coming to America. But it doesn't end there. Let's talk
Right.
about war. Let's talk about the Civil War. Let's talk about World War I, World War II,
Hmm.
the Vietnam War, where not just African Americans now, but all fathers, uh, a lot of them had to be enlisted in the military. And that's another example of being separated from your family. So now, because of the wars, the multiple wars I just named are going on, and it's a draft where you don't have a choice. You have to do this as a part of representing your quote unquote country, but you just had a newborn over here. You
Hmm.
you have a family with 2 kids, but the government doesn't care about none of that. So now here's another example of fathers being detached from their families. All those wars I just named. Now we can here's another example. We can talk about the war on drugs, the
Hmm.
war on poverty. Now we're moving into the 19th century, 50s, 60s, 70s, things of that nature. These things that were addressed, war on drugs, war on poverty, specifically targeted a lot of men, and a
Yeah.
lot of men being African Americans, Hispanics, whites, to tackle this
Low.
thing
Yeah.
called poverty, to tackle this thing called drugs. And what it did was lock a lot of people up, get a lot of people out the home because you're already on the poverty line. And so, in order to keep your rent at $25, the male can't be there because they're going to consider that as a second income. So the male has to live elsewhere just so your family can be supported by the government. And there's no real opportunity to connect, to bond, to nurture as a dad. So we can
And
even go as the hospital. For a long
right.
time, the man wasn't even let in the delivery room. You had to wait outside in the waiting room with a cigar and hope a nurse come back and say you got a boy or you got a girl, but you weren't even allowed to be in there. And I'm not making an excuse for fathers not being nurturing, but from the beginning, we haven't been given, especially African Americans and minorities, we haven't been given the opportunity to be shown what it looks like.
Exactly. And that's something, even If people want to ignore, excuse the wars because they were, necessary for survival, you want to excuse the racism because you don't want to see it. Even, the railroads, the highway, the industrial revolution here in the US was, just as much of an example as these other things too, because you've got, you've got fathers that are offered a good amount of money to go, build this railroad system, to
Mhm.
build these highways, to build these skyscrapers, bridges that you know, die from this dangerous work. And now here we are again, where now we've got these kids having to be raised without their dad. You've got, the Great Depression era of, you've
Mhm.
got people that are having to work so much. This is not just a war racing. This really is a unfortunate cultural phenomenon that has kind of come about, not just in the US. This is really a Western model. But as much as we've tried to progress and tried to build up, the nation and build up our financial status, the more that we continue to see the cycle go on of dad's job is to go and make the money and mom can take care of the nurturing, but the result of it is that now you have kids with no dad. And now with the new economic crisis, now we've gone a step further where now it's not just no dad in the home, now it's also no mom, because even the stuff that dad is making is not enough to support the family. And
Right.
so we've lost all of this nurture side of, the nurturing side of things is just gone at this point.
Right. So then we fast forward to 2021, and there's a lot of dads out there, and they're being expected a lot more of them than just working. I know my wife
Hmm.
does. But when you've never been shown the necessary tools on how to be a nurturing father, it's all new to you. You're
Hmm.
just content with going to work, coming home, taking out the trash, and doing the bare minimum, or being a disciplinarian, just handling the bad stuff from your child making mistakes, or getting in trouble in school. You're just looked at as a disciplinarian. So to be looked at as more than that and looked at as a nurturing father is something new for this generation, is something new for some of us. And I would argue that it's not a nurturing father doesn't mean you're a metrosexual, or you're
Hmm.
into more things of a woman, but it just means, if we boil it down to the black or white, is that you are in tune with your kids' needs and wants, and in tune with who they can become.
And this is something that, we'll continue this discussion a little bit more, next week, even more, as far as what this looks like in a societal standpoint. But um probably we should make this clear also, just so people know where we're coming from. I grew up in a two-parent Christian home. You grew up in a two-parent, I believe you said it was a Christian home also, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We both grew up with examples of what a father is supposed to look like. Um, but it doesn't change the reality that a lot of people did not. And a lot of our listeners, we're sure a lot of our listeners probably are ones that did not. And so it doesn't, just because we grew up with the reality of dad being in the home and dad being nurturing, doesn't mean that this does not exist. Just because you grew up with a nurturing father does not mean it does not exist. This is an unfortunate reality within today's society and today's culture. Um, we've got a little bit of time here left. Give us, Dahmer, give us these things you brought back from your conference. What are these 5 constructs that lead to abusive and damaged relationships as a father?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. 5 constructs. These are characteristics that can lead to, like you said, an abusive and non-abusive parenting behavior. And to be truthful, Andrew, I've fallen victim to these behaviors just because of some of the experiences I've been through growing up, and how my parents were. They did the best they could, but it's just, this is what it is. And so I'm going to list the 5 unrealistic development expectations: the inability to empathize with child's needs, reliance on corporal punishment, parent-child role reversal, and oppressing a child's behavior and independence. These are the things, characteristics that can lead to an abusive and non-abusive parenting. And it all comes from this idea or notion of parenting from fear and violence. And that is tied in with toxic masculinity.
Yeah, and this is also an area, unfortunately, that going into the ministry misfits realm here of what we do with our 3 tier. This is another big area where we see people misapplying biblical mandates and biblical principles. As far as what parenting and fatherhood is supposed to look like. When some of these ones that you're talking about, especially the ones that are more violent or disciplinary in nature, there's been a history of looking the other way when dad is in an abusive setting with their children, because of the fact that's looked at as the verse of do not spare, don't spare the rod and your child will grow. That's not at all what scripture is actually talking about, because like we just said, we're talking about the fact that God has this nurturing attribute to him, and we see that in the way that we see that in the Old Testament, we see this in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm,
This is
mm-hmm.
God is not just fire and brimstone, even though that's what unfortunately some churches try to paint God as. God is also one that shows loving mercy, that his mercies are renewed, sins are as far as the east and from the west. There's a whole nother side to it. But unfortunately, what we like to do is we like to look at this idea of don't spare the rod, and we like to
Right.
turn that into, well, because I am the father and I have father superiority and father authority, I do not have to follow such and such a pain management, all these different attributes that typically get brought up by psychologists and things like that. Those don't apply to me, because as a Christian father, my job is to discipline my children.
Right. But what I would say, and I'm not telling a dad not to spank their child, but according to this program that or conference I went to, virtual conference I went to, 2 things that struck a chord with me. One is that when you rely on corporal punishment, this idea of spanking or whooping your child's ending result is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
They are left with trauma, and it stifles their mental growth.
And and the word you use, 2 words that you use there, I think, are the key to actually understanding this. One of them is, you said, rely on. And
Right.
when it becomes the only thing you can do is rely on this one, that means that you either you've tried and you think you failed, and so you're not trying any other methods, or it means that this has always worked in your family history, and so it always is going to work now, which now we're back to, again, what we talked about with the absentee fathers and the toxic masculinity of the cycle is continuing.
Right. And the truth be told, not to cut you off, the truth be told is that a lot of us just don't have enough tools
Right.
when it comes to parenting. They don't, you don't understand this thing called, restorative practice or restitution, or, just conversation. The Bible talks about more teaching, training, and correction than it does corporal punishment.
Right. And
And
this is
so,
where, that right there is where, that second word you used of trauma, we think of trauma as it's always a bad thing and there's no benefit from it. But, the reality of trauma is that trauma in small doses is actually it is a psychological tool to tell us, it's a traumatic experience when you stick your hand in a fire and it burns, but it teaches us not to do that again. And
right,
this is where, again, if you are not relying, where this is the only recourse you have is, physical discipline. When that's the only recourse you have, it's going to go beyond just trauma of, oh, this is not a good idea, I should not do this, to this is the only thing that my parents are capable of doing. And
right,
that's when the damage starts to come into the relationship. And unfortunately, that is a lot of time, historically, of what we hear from kids that are now in the, oh, I will never, spank my child, or the kids are like, I will only spank my child. Is the trauma has gone from a tool to teach to, this is the way that it always is done. And so this is the way either it's never going to be or it's always going to be.
right. And Romans tells us that, Paul says it in Romans 8:28, that be ye transformed
Hmm.
by the renewing of your mind. It's a mind thing. You're not, compelled to spank your child. You're not a robot. It's what's been in your mind and what you've been trained. And so you have to retrain your mind and be open to different tools, because there's also a statistic that says that the more that fathers are in tune with their children, the less likely they will spank or whoop them.
Right. And, and this is something, I have a toddler at the moment who, cannot understand some of these more complex things. And so, spanking is much more of a go-to at the moment because it's more of a matter of you've got to learn, but timeout is also an option, things like that. But as she gets older and can understand more, the punishments, the disciplinary things are going to be able to develop with her, because it is about this idea, especially for, again, those of us that are coming at this from the idea of biblical parenthood.
Hmm.
And like you said at the beginning, of the idea of developing into who they should or who they can become, and especially for us, again, from biblical model of the people that God is shaping them to be. This is much more than just, oh, they did something wrong, so they're being punished. This is, okay, this is my child, but I also know that this child is a sinful human being that needs the grace of God. And so my job as the parent is to train them up to understand that they need God. I need God. We all need God to be able to redeem us and to do this idea of transforming our mind and renewing our mind and reconciling our actions. And
Right,
once we allow that to kind of shape the perspective of which we face this idea of discipline, the idea, the whole phrase of, this is going to hurt you more, or this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you, ideal of punishment becomes a reality, because you don't want to punish them, because the reality is that you're punishing them for something that you yourself do either did on a regular basis at their age, or you are doing on a regular basis still in a much more adult form.
hmm,
But
hmm,
without the discipline, without the idea of, it's an empathetic nurturing and a discipleship, and it's the idea of, correction, not discipline, it's correction. They're not going to be able to become the person that God is wanting them to become.
right. And then I
It's
mentioned that in the five constructs, the
Mhm.
inability to empathize with the child's needs. When you know your children, it's easier to empathize with them and understand, especially, my kids are 7 and 5, understand where they're coming from and the things they're supposed to do or the things that they're not doing. And
Hmm.
so, no, I absolutely get it.
And I think the place I want to go before we close out here is reread number 5. I think it was number 5.
Okay, number 5 is oppressing a child's behavior and independence.
Yeah, I think that was the one. Maybe it was 4, but yeah, I think that was one where,
So four is parent-child role reversal.
oh yeah, it's no, we were going with 5. 4 is
Okay,
pretty self-explanatory. If your kids are raising themselves and are doing the disciplining of you, then we that's a whole nother conversation that we need to have. Uh, number 5 though is the one that this is something that needs to be talked about a little bit more, and you and I may not even be the ones necessarily to do it. This is one that gets much more into people that specialize in early childhood, but this idea of oppressing or suppressing individuality within children is becoming it's one of those things where it's becoming a much bigger debate now, with the fact that we actually understand, and this doesn't just apply to this situation, but this is what I was thinking of as you're talking about, of the understanding of the autism spectrum within children. Is we see, and this again goes back to the empathy as well, is there are some children where these actions that we don't want them to do for whatever reason, whether it's because of a toxic masculinity thing, whether it's whatever it is, we don't want them doing this. It may actually be that this is the person that God has created them to be. There are kids that they cannot handle the large crowds, which is perfectly okay, because they are going to be much more of a individual type person. You've got some kids that are, they don't do well in a classroom setting, but if you sit them down, they're going to be able to teach you what the textbook is actually talking about on a specific subject, because it just clicks with them. And when we
right,
start to do these cookie cutter approaches to things, we again, we're repeating that same cycle of, this is the way it always has been, and so this is the way it's going to be, or this is the way it's always been and we don't want that anymore, so this is how it's going to be.
right,
We've taken away the creative angle of our kids and the individual angle of our kids. And actually, this does kind of tie into number 4. In some cases, we do need a little bit of the role reversal, because our kids can teach us some different things about ourselves as well, if we allow them to be the individual God's created them to be.
yeah, and I think that number 4 is talking about putting the responsibilities of a parent on a
Right.
child, or
Right.
specifically the oldest child. That was something that I dealt with growing up. Having to watch my siblings and what have you. And so, but if we're talking about 5, we're really talking about oppressing a child's behavior is oppressing their personality, because you feel like a young boy shouldn't do that, a young girl
Hmm.
shouldn't do that, and not allowing them to have the freedom of some choices. Jesus
Right.
gives us freedom. He doesn't force his will on you. It's a choice. It's a choice to serve God. You know what I mean? Nobody is forcing me to believe in God, to worship God. It's a choice. And so, God has never oppressed, my behavior, and so we shouldn't oppress our children's behavior, because what that does is it leaves them with a low self-esteem.
Right.
If you force them and not give them choices, then they say yes to everything. And what if their boyfriend, girlfriend, or spouse is doing something that's not right? Well, their
Hmm.
whole life they've been taught and been conditioned to say yes, and they don't know how to say no.
Exactly. And that again is part of why that cycle is what we unfortunately see play out in a lot of our communities today is this idea of either on one side of the relationship, all they've ever seen is nothing but discipline and violence in the discipline form, or the flip side of where it's you are not good enough to be the person that God has created you to be. So you need to try to fit this model. And if you don't, then you're not doing it right. So we've got to make changes. And those two things, when they come together, as a perfect storm for domestic abuse, domestic violence, for, family, family strife, family trauma, family stress. This unfortunately, and a lot of it does come from this idea of society has always said this is what a man looks like.
Right.
And when you lose the other side of the continuum of, the more nurturing side, and you only focus on one, then it just continues the cycle of either abusive husbands or abused fathers, one or the other.
Right. And that's why, for me, I really took notes on that, and I really wrote that down and meditated on it, because a lot of times you don't even know that you are a part of these five constructs because it's so normalized, and so we want to break that, and we want to retrain our mind into something that represents who Jesus is, who God is, his spirit and his characteristics.
Right. So I believe that's all the time we've got for today. Minister Misfits crew, Chalmer will be back with us next week, and we are going to look at some of these other cycles that we see here in the U.S. And he's going to be able to provide both a personal perspective as well as help us understand a theological perspective on a lot of these issues. If you would like to support Mr. Misfits, you can do that in a couple of ways. One is just by sharing the podcast, whether that's the audio podcast or the video, which Fatherhood Friday people, if you want to see the video version, that we have a little bit of a note-taking system on the side. If you want to go back and watch the video, you can do that either on the Ministry Misfits Facebook page, or you can do that on our YouTube channel. Both of the videos will be there, and you can get some better notes that way. If you would like to support Mr. Misfits, again, share the videos, share the podcast. You can also financially support us in two ways. One is at anchor.fm/Mr. Misfits. Click on the support button there. If you'd rather do it for a tax credit, you can do that by going to csrm.org/donate. Then click on the actual donate button. I promise eventually we will get that fixed. And then you just select Andrew Fouts in the drop-down menu. That money not only goes to support Mr. Misfits, but it also goes to support the CSRM mission and vision at large internationally. Chalmer, any sign-offs you want to do for Fatherhood Fridays?
Fatherhood Fridays, weekly episodes air every Friday. You can catch them. I airs them as early as 7 in the morning. Stay tuned. Go to the website, www.fatherhoodfridays.com. If you would like to listen to old episodes, you can support me as well by going to the support tab and clicking 3 times. And you can donate anywhere from 99 cents to $9.99. And that's about it.
Yeah, I don't know why. It seems like we can never get donate buttons to work the first time on websites. It's probably a good thing, considering that, the toddler can take your phone, and, she purchased me a $80 video game for Father's Day one year accidentally when she got a hold of the controller. So it's probably a good thing we've got these safeguards in, but it can be very annoying when you're trying to raise support. So anyway, happy Father's Day to all you fathers, whether that's biologically or you are the father figure. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that either through my Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. That's at Ministry Misfit. Or you can email me at it's ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com. You can also get a hold of Chalmer through his website at fatherhoodfridays.com or .org? I already forgot.
.com.
Fatherhoodfridays.com. You can get a hold of Chalmer there as well. So thank you all for listening, and Ministry Misfits, go check out Fatherhood Fridays. Fatherhood Fridays, come check out Ministry Misfits. We will see you all later.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Overwhelming Victory Flicks, Overwhelming Victory Radio, and Ministry Misfits Media. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. Our music is provided by Morning Light Music and is titled Rain. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can support Ministry Misfits at anchor.fm/Ministry Misfits or for a FO1c3 credit by going to csrm.org/donate and selecting Andrew Fouts in the campaign menu. To learn more about Overwhelming Victory or to listen to our sister podcast, visit overwhelmingvictory.org.